What did you think, Owen?
Mark, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I felt it was very. I just like on a sort of like the joy of reading kind of thing. I just sort of felt like this is just a lot of fun to read, and I sort of had the feeling as I was going through it, as I was reading it, I thought, oh, I'm one of his prophets, and I'm the one who's just so completely misunderstood, and if only I'd been brought up on the south side of Dublin, none of this would be happening to me, and all this. So I enjoyed it a great deal, but I have to say I did find myself picking arguments with him. I just thought that maybe there were some areas where I thought this isn't quite thought out enough, or it's maybe he's not sort of seeing it in the picture in its fullest complexity. Now, I know when you're working in a sociological way, you have to sort of label things and simplify things, or in order to be able to juxtapose one idea against another. So sometimes these things are necessary. But I did think, that I suppose I did think there were a few things that I thought, yeah, there's some answers to what it is he has to say. Like, for example, I do think that I definitely, there is a sort of a premise. It kind of implied. I tried to go back over the first few pages and see where does he say this precisely, but I couldn't quite find precisely where he said it. It was something that I implied, and I'm implied in what I'd read was that there's the sense that the architects are the arbiters of good taste in society. They're the ones who set the tone, and I'm not 100% sure that really is the case. I think that there'd be a lot of other people out there in Western European countries, people from other pursuits who'd say, no, it's us. Like, for example, I make films, and I'm a member of the Screen Directors Guild, so I occasionally, join these kinds of things, little book clubby type discussions. And I do find that I always find those meetings a challenge. They're lovely people, wonderful, some of them. But I do find those meetings a challenge, because you can be on the right or wrong side of the debate at least a half dozen times in the space of an hour. And talk about contingent, you'd have absolutely no idea what you had said right or what you had said wrong. And there is a feeling, I think, in the people in TV and media that they are definitely, without question, the arbiters of taste, and that they are the closest to God. And they would sort of see, architects as a kind of a nerdy curiosity, with interesting clothes and some interesting things to say, but very, very far from being influential. So I think that there is in all walks of life, there is also, if you were to take the word architect or field of architecture out of his text, and substitute in every single time transition year secondary school, I think you'd also have a thesis which is equally applicable. On the other hand, though, it is true, yes, of course, within, as architects ourselves, we know perfectly well what he's talking about, But again, I found myself asking myself a question, Mark, about when I decided to teach, which is going back 12 years ago. I was really, it was something that it came out of doing a master's degree. I hadn't really thought about it. I really thought I'd be sort of, I'd go off and just be sort of corporate-y, one of his, whatever the term is used for those type of architects. But the master's degree made me think, and I wondered, I'd like to teach, because I've been doing some lectures in UCD as a result of doing my master's at UBC with Gauquelin. And then I ended up doing a couple of lectures in Waterford, and I thought, Waterford's better in a way. Like, UCD obviously is very renowned and is established, but when you're in Waterford, what I thought, it's very interesting here. I'm not struck by the fact that any kind of hierarchy exists here at all. If I meet the people in the faculty here, we can pretty much say anything we like. Nobody is looking to see, is he on the right or the wrong side of this political, thing or not. Whereas in Dublin, you're always, and in London, you're always aware of that there is a kind of a battlefield there, an ideological battlefield, or a taste battlefield. So I guess, and I really think as well, like if I meet my friends, architect friends or friends from other walks of life, I live in Killaloe, and most of my friends, I suppose, would not be from Dublin, I suppose. we are, when we talk, and we would frequently, like we have our little Zoom sessions. I talk to my friends every day, and we chatted about this yesterday. I sent them on the link. Some of them are ag scientists, and some of them are scientists, and some of them whatever they are. And we chatted about this particular article yesterday. And it was funny that we were saying that, if we were amongst ourselves, we can say, there are things that we can say very freely about this article. But if we were talking to the Dublin crowd, there'd be certain things we might not say. And I thought I just found it interesting. I thought, yeah, there's a truth to it. There's something definitely there. But yeah, so that was maybe I just.
I will tell you, Gary, that we, Alice and Owen and myself, are generally doing private messages back and forth between ourselves, which I'm afraid we can't include you in because Waterford. Actually, the Paddy Kavanagh once made a distinction between the provincial and the parochial, and for him, the parochial was an ideal. He was a big ruralist, and the village with the pump and the square and the people who knew each other. But he hated the provincial mentality. And I think that what it touches on is, for him, Dublin was provincial, whereas the village was parochial, and that was a great thing. But for him, for the provincial town is one where everyone's always looking somewhere else for guidance on what's the cool thing, what's the latest thing, and so on. And that's kind of what you're describing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember one time, an extern coming down to us in Waterford, going back a few years, from Dublin, and suggesting to us, not Hugh, I know Hugh had been an extern, definitely not Hugh, somebody else, saying that we'd be better served if we were to think more about how we could perform less as a national school and more as a very strong parochial school. And that's the kind of thing that, it's frustrating. It's very frustrating.
Interesting.
But I mean, on by and large, I did find it really a fascinating read. I mean, I really enjoyed it, and I just thought it was very entertaining. I just loved going through it and identifying and the baddies. And I actually, technically, I suppose I worked. Very briefly for Philip Johnson in New York.
Oh, did you?
Technically, I did. I used to have a second job earning extra money, working for a company called Johnson, Ritchie and Fiore. And it was a brief period when Philip Johnson had merged his company with another company called Ritchie Fiore. And I'd actually been doing the work for Ritchie and Fiore. Well, I'd go around to their office in the evening and work there until 11 or 12 at night. They were located in the Lipstick Building in Manhattan, that one. And Philip Johnson used to sit there until all hours. He had his own little space over in the corner. He would have been in his 90s at that stage. He was sitting there amongst just working away busily on his little projects.
Wow. Did any of you guys read it?
Yeah. Yeah, I got through about 3/4 of it, but I did enjoy it. What I did read, yeah, I don't know. The student perspective, that I have at the minute is I related to it a lot. That the kind of the lofty intellectuals in their priestly robes and stuff like that. But yeah, I did also kind of recognize that. I don't know. I personally thought that he was attributing too much. He was oversimplifying a bit that the upper classes are the guardians of taste and stuff. Especially, I don't know. I feel that's a bit less relevant in the world now, perhaps, than when that was written.
Yeah. Why? What do you think has changed, though?
Just kind of. Internet and social media and stuff has democratized everything that much, especially among younger generations and stuff. And it's no longer. I mean, people still aspire towards kind of materialistic ideals and stuff, but in terms of culture, music, art and stuff, I'm not sure. Architecture isn't so important in that sphere.
That would be very, very, very. I've been reading around this kind of stuff for years, and I'd love to know more about that suggestion, whether and to what extent, because things of course do change, but I would be inclined to believe, I suspect that the thesis of Bourdieu holds, but of course it's changing, and how is it changing because of those things? So the power structures are there, but they change, they take a different form, they metastasize, they diffuse, they become more, but at the same time, there are 4 owners of all these platforms for 7 billion people. So, to say that the power structures have disappeared, of course, is not true.
I think it's interesting how the way the internet works, that if you've got an idea, architectural or otherwise, and you want to explore it, you can go around Dublin, whereas in the past you couldn't. Or even these days, you can go around London. If you know that there's a certain kind of hostility to your position, not an hostility, but you find yourself on the wrong side of the debate or whatever, you can find your audience elsewhere. And there will be enough people who, if you look hard enough, there will be enough people who are like-minded to you on the internet, that you're not really seeking an audience. You're sort of seeking a sense of community, the half dozen people in this place or that place who just happen to think the same way that you do. You have that sense of reassurance that you're not just entirely on your own. And it could be, in itself, it becomes quite satisfying then. And I think a lot of this, I really do think a lot of that goes on, Mark and Owen and Alice, with, I think that's happening a lot where, if you're into a certain kind of music or you want to develop a certain kind of music, you don't have to beat a door to the A&R man's office. There's other ways of going about it. And provided you get the opportunity to do it and to share it to a degree adequately, you don't feel that great sense of needing to compete against the whole, you don't feel like you have to take on the whole world.
I think you probably do, to the extent that to make sales, you need to sell a lot of things. So you need to find a way to get to a lot of people. And I kind of think that will come back in some form, no matter how much the media allows you to be independent of older sources or older structures of production. What you see, the key phrase from Marx is constant revolutionizing of production. The constant, the capitalism, the bourgeois epoch releases this genie, which is constantly revolutionizing. And it's not actually moving towards anything less to do with production. And production has always got to be, how do you maximize your capitals? And you can find niches on the internet, but they may not be any use to you. And this goes right back to architecture, because architecture, even if you're working on the internet free of traditional power structures, you still need the capital to build the thing at the end of the day. It still needs to be funded.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, Mark. I think that maybe just at the period that we're in, and maybe it might be something that young people are about to discover, is that, for people of your and my generation, we've been around this cycle a few times. So yes, eventually it does catch up. Eventually you go online, you discover somebody is interfering between what it is you want to achieve and how it's going to be achieved. So ultimately, I mean, like lately, for example, I was mentioning to a colleague of mine that say 5 or 6 years ago, if I wanted to download any article or any piece that I wanted to, I could probably go online and, somebody would have it, there's a PFD or PDF of so-and-so's article or piece. But these days, that's getting harder and harder to do, Scribed and JSTOR and everybody else, they all have control of the information. And, the sort of wonderful thing that was happening, maybe let's say 10 years ago, when if you thought about any article you wanted or any book that was in the public realm, you could find it any place. It's not quite so easy now.
Alice, did you, because of your research topic that you mentioned to me earlier in the year, did you find any use in this article? Did you get to read it, or did you find any?
I didn't actually get to read the whole thing, but yeah, it was very interesting. and kind of witty in the way that it's written as well, which like makes it nicer to read. But it didn't, yeah, I suppose it didn't quite relate, or maybe if I finished it, it might relate back to the essay that I'm planning on doing.
You were looking at, in your research topic, you asked me about earlier, it had to do with landscapes and
yeah, like the,
as being,
you know,
power.
idealistic and power and control. And yeah, in the text, I found like it was how they like are not, the higher classes say are not they are interested both in like say opera and rock, and how they have like they dominate everything by doing that, and it's so subtle, and also this idea of taste is just like a power thing as well, and how they it's seen as like something natural when it's really not. I found that was very interesting at the start.
That's key, I think. I mean, if you're even particularly looking at your topic, if it is still landscape that you're looking at, and landscape design, natural, the other sense of natural plays a really big important role. To zoom back to the beginning, he begins here. By the way, Garry Stevens, it's absolutely hard to believe, but he is the first person, and it's only 20 years ago, who used the Bourdieusian methods of analysis, his Bourdieu's type of sociology. The first person to shine this on architecture, because Bourdieu didn't, was Garry Stevens. And many writers since have acknowledged this, but not Helena Webster. This is just a little detail because I've been reading around this stuff for years. Helena Webster, who'd been with Oxford Brookes and a few other places, who had done some good work in education and who wrote a book called Bourdieu for Architects. I hope this, maybe I should pause the recording, but I do feel that had she not, don't pause the recording, that she had not drawn the conclusions from Bourdieu. She treated Bourdieu as just a kind of an academic subject that architects might become interested in. But if you go back to the beginning of the thing we just read, it said that Bourdieu is interested in how culture serves power. That's his interest. So he's interested in how do symbolic goods, which are produced for the productions of culture, how do they serve the interests of the ruling classes? And he says they do this by naturalizing and legitimizing the relations of production. He doesn't use that term, but the social relations, the class system. And in the case of landscape gardens, there are so many examples in history, but most famously the English garden of the 18th century, where just at the moment when the English countryside was being subject to massive privatization by the government for the sake of the new industrial processes and the farming in common that had taken place for centuries prior to that was being destroyed. And huge numbers of people were being uprooted from the countryside and were having to go into the new industrial towns to work. At this precise moment emerges this naturalistic type of landscape design, which reproduces a vision of nature for the benefit of the recipients of this new wealth. And if you look closely at how that works, look at the detail of the ha-ha and look at how the view from the house is designed so that the division between the productive landscape and the house is blurred. All of this serves this precisely naturalizing function to make it seem universal and to make this image seem as though this obeys rules. And what makes this really interesting in culture is that is that successful cultural work really is universal in its own terms, really does produce works of great beauty and great harmony and great persuasive power. And Bourdieu is just interested in how these serve social purposes. So the key thing to Bourdieu is he wants to, in this debate in late Marxism, when Marxism was looking at culture, it kept running aground on the problem of structure versus agency, which is all a bit technical here, but it kept running up against the problem that a Marxist critique of culture seemed to deny the independence of artists, shall we say. It seemed to say that everyone was merely a cog in a machine, that everyone was merely, being like pinballs being thrown around, like this, sent from one thing to another. And Bourdieu insists on both the autonomy of the cultural and its embeddedness in the systems of production. And so his key idea is called symbolic power or symbolic violence. And he says that every act of symbolic power, this is the beginning of one of his books, he says, is it contributes, it works by denying its basis in class, in power relations. And it contributes its own specifically symbolic power to those class relations. But the key there is that it has its own symbolic power. The artists who are because they're in the subordinate part of the dominant class, the architects and artists, that gives them autonomy relative to the dominant part of the dominant class. And they can occasionally form alliances, as he says in this article, with the subordinate class at times of crisis. So last night I saw a film from Mexico in the film festival, the most dystopian thing I've seen in a long time, about a rich family. Once again, the idea of it's a beautiful architect's home, they're having a wedding and a revolution takes place and it's just grim and gets grimmer and grimmer. Everyone gets killed and the whole thing is horrible, horrible. And afterwards the director is interviewed by Alan Gilson and he said, the young director said, I am a member of this class in a country in Mexico rather, where 60% of people are living very close to absolute poverty. And I made this film out of a sense of guilt, but he himself is making this incredibly critical. So he's a classic example of the subordinate part of the dominant class, forming an alliance at a time of crisis with the subordinate class. Yeah, I think that's what Bourdieu wants to look at, is how art works within the class structure.
No, I definitely, I'm not that, I have come across Bourdieu a bit in the past, and I'm not that familiar, but I definitely get, and I suppose my own feeling, I have a lot of sympathy for this way of thinking, but I do think there is a possibility of an out for people in it, Mark. You see, I think a lot of one thing that say Stevens doesn't do at all. He talks about the field of architecture, but he doesn't at any point try to attempt to define architecture or say what it is. And I think that's kind of telling, that architecture is put to use to make his argument. But I prefer to think a little bit more about, if I think about the nature of the thing itself, the architecture itself, and I pursue those thoughts, then none of the cultural battle that's going on around me, it just no longer exists. And I know I say that from a point of privilege because I've got a permanent pensionable job and I can lecture and all that kind of thing. But it's something that I talk to my students about a lot, is to, if at all possible, to focus on the possibility of thinking specifically about the nature of the thing, the poetic arrangement of space, and this thing that you've got a skill in doing. Because if you allow yourself to drift to into Garry Stevens' mode of thinking, I think the danger is you become a slave to an agenda. And I think it's much better. I prefer to encourage my student, or me anyway, to say, no, I'm going to be a slave to the craft. I'm just going to focus on that craft. What is that thing that, say, somebody like Palladio was able to do in the Teatro Olimpico, or Michelangelo in the Laurentian, and analyze it and pick it apart and put it back together again and do a Colin Rowe on it until I can do it too, and bring something meaningful to the game. And I do think that there is a possibility for an out in it.
What do you mean an out? In a way through?
That you don't have to. I think in Garry Stevens' reading of it, there is a sort of an implication that once you become an architect, you get a degree and you're qualified and you're out there working, that you're either part of the dominant or the subordinate. You're either this or you're that. But I think, no, you can be out of that entirely. You don't have to be in it at all. You can avoid it. And I think life allows for that to happen. And you mightn't become enormously rich, and you might not necessarily dominate the world with your great architectural ideas, and you might not, it might be like, you might just be a sort of an asterisk like a McCormick Church, but that in itself might be all that you have to accept, that might be what if you can achieve that, that can be very satisfying, and just do it.
So are you saying, Garry, that do you think the best approach for architects is to not think about the class position, their class position?
Yes, I do, yeah. I do.
What do you have any view on it, Owen and Alice? Do you have any view on that point?
I would think that would mean that architects are almost kind of acting like artists in a way, or like that they have that autonomy, which in real life they don't really, because architects can't make their own designs without other people's money at the end of the day. And that's the way architects usually work, is that they need to work with clients in order to realize what they want to do. And I don't know, I feel like that sounds nice, but that sounds to me like it would be a massive struggle to be striving towards that the whole time. And I don't know if I don't see how that would ultimately be satisfying more than it would be frustrating. And
Owen, did you get to the point in the article? He made a very funny point. He said, it's a great tragedy that most architects can earn a living at architecture.
Yeah.
It seems to be something to do with what you're saying. Do you remember the point?
Yeah, because if architects couldn't, then they would have the freedom that artists and I don't know, the painters have, like pure craftspeople as well. But architects don't.
Because we're part of the productive cycle.
Because
being able to earn a living at it means that we're actually part of the economy in a way that the fine artist is less likely to be.
Yeah. But I don't see how architecture could be any other way either. Like a building is a lot more complicated than a piece of art. It requires a lot more materials and money and everything. And the architect can't even build it himself, usually, or herself.
Even if all buildings were made successfully out of Kleenex and spit, then, in other words, even if they weren't expensive, I didn't mean to make a disgusting analogy there, but it was accidental. Even if they weren't expensive to build, they would still involve, because of there being buildings, they would still involve people going about their lives. So therefore they would connect with the economy in this way. So even if architecture itself didn't cost anything to produce, it would still be integrated into the economy because of the movement of the economy through the buildings in one form or another, whether as commodified objects or as places of production or as places of infrastructural elements or educational institutions and so on and so on and so on. It just seems that architecture cannot. Garry, is this a challenge to your point? Or how does this address your point that you think the architect is best to, if you like, I think you're suggesting a kind of a blinkeredness to their social positioning.
Yeah, I would say a blinkeredness as opposed to a non-participation. It's something that maybe I'd be more conscious of working in Waterford. I mean, I feel this is, maybe Adam can back me up on this, but it's something as a lecturer, I think maybe you spend more time talking to your students about saying, it's true, you come from disadvantage. It's true, we're not the AA, we're Waterford. It's true that you have to deal with these things, and students themselves are conscious of it, that there's a structure in place that operates on a lot of complex levels that they suddenly have to deal with if they want to be able to make a career and to get a mortgage and have a family and whatever. So it's something that maybe we think about more, maybe I think about more. I don't think perhaps I'd be quite so obliged to do it if I was, maybe in UCD or in some other school in England or whatever, where I don't mean, you know what I mean if I say there'd be more sort of like middle class schools, if you like. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. Oh, I've just gotten a lovely cup of tea. Thanks very much. So, but I do think that it is possible to have a blinkered approach. And I do think it is possible to focus on those things which are to do with a fuller understanding of the making of space. And I do think it is possible to carve out a living that way. I think that when you mention to people this, this is what I want to do, this is where I'm at, I'm not trying to make a major of, or I'm not going to rush to get this published in every magazine article or magazine or on every TV show, Designs for Life thing that's coming up. I'm just going to do something cool for you, I think, or do my best. I think a lot of people would go a long way with that, and that's been my experience.
But what about the problem raised by our reading, which is, to what extent is it useful or in any way productive in our world to take on board the Bourdieusian critique, which is our implication in relations of production, in the social order, in the class system? To what extent is it useful?
Yeah. I think a lot of, sorry, Mark, go ahead. I'm cutting across you there.
No, I just to say, is it useful? I guess is my, and I think you're saying it's not useful. You say that.
No, I definitely think it's useful, Mark. I definitely think it's useful because once somebody holds it up and says, "This is it," like the Garry Stevens, like the essay, you go, "Well, thank you, Gary. That's helped me to clarify my thinking." But I don't think, I definitely think it's very, very useful. I think it's a very good way of saying to a student, look, read this. This is very likely to happen. You'll find yourself very likely in this sort of a situation, and you might find it quite paralyzing, very difficult. But so perhaps when you do wake up in the morning and you find that you're facing into a day or a week or a project or a month or a client or whatever, where this sort of structure is staring at you and causing you anxiety, put on some blinkers and you'll be fine.
The structure, you mean the class structure?
The class structure, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I guess what I'm teasing out here is, I think you are suggesting that in order to believe in what you're doing as an architect, in a way you do have to bracket out your social.
Yes, I do. I definitely think that. Yeah.
What about Hugh? What about?
Well, I'll jump in as a person who hasn't read the piece, but has read some Bourdieu, so a little bit. I was thinking there was a piece done a few years ago by some people in our school actually about using Bourdieu to talk about the house extension, as the point being using his idea of habitus, that there's a sort of set of practices that build up around particular people, particular kind of outputs and so on and so forth, and it's much to do with objects and people and and it was applied. It was Michael Pike and Emmett and a few others who applied this to, if you think about the greatest collective architectural endeavor in Ireland of the past generation is the making of hundreds of extensions that are all seen one way, incredibly individual and very attuned to the specifics of the client and the place and the person who builds it and all that, and then seen another way are all entirely the same. They're all the product of similar sorts of processes, similar kinds of. So in other words, there's a and actually I thought it was a very enabling, I think they thought it was an enabling rather than a disabling sort of way of thinking, to understand this as a sort of endeavor that is bound up in much larger forces, that is as much happening to them as them producing it, if you know what I mean. I don't think that's a blinkeredness. I think that's a sort of an alertness to it, but a sort of, noticing that you're swimming in water every now and then, if you're a fish, just is kind of good for you, maybe. It doesn't mean you stop swimming. It just means you understand the medium in which you swim. Now that's a less political reading, I think, that's more Helena Webster than Garry Stevens.
Well, yeah.
in a way.
Say more about that, Helena Webster, because I mentioned her earlier. I've been in touch with her.
Yeah, no, it's just more like picking up on what you were saying. And actually, Michael Pike uses Bourdieu a lot in the way he talks about drawing and drawing as practice and so on. But I think, again, he was kind of slightly more fixing on this idea of forms of collective practice, of habitus, rather than thinking about this as a way in which, let's say, capitalism manages to continue by making these kinds of formation, cultural formation. Not expressing that very well, but you know.
No, yeah. I think
kind of stripped it of its.
You need the field to get the full Bourdieusian structure. You need the field, and any particular field, as he says in the article we wrote, it's like a playing field or a battlefield, or a field of forces, a force field, and agents arrive there, each equipped with a habitus which they share. The habitus is shared between them all, and they compete like players on the field to maximize their capitals. And he, as I said at the beginning, what is considered to be very useful for thinkers with Bourdieu is his insistence that our embeddedness in relations of production is actually not inconsistent with autonomy. In fact, if you think about it, in order to use Marx's line that the ideas of the ruling class in every epoch are the ruling ideas, for those to be ruling ideas, they have to be really very deeply imagined. Because a ruling idea is one that appeals to everybody, that appears to be universal and maybe even timeless. A ruling idea is one that everybody, or a lot of people, look at and go, yes, that is true. Yes, that is beautiful. Those are ruling ideas. Now, to say that the ideas of the ruling class are the only ruling ideas is a deeply cynical view. But Bourdieu gives us a way out of that, to say that cultural production is both autonomous and heteronymous. The terrible word heteronomy, but it is both productive and reproductive of social class hierarchies. It can only be that way by being autonomous, by artists being like Michelangelo, by artists being like, pick the greatest ones, who truly are independent, who truly are obeying laws different from the laws of the ruling classes, i.e., who really aren't doing it just for the money, who really have become lost in their art. And it's, I guess, our challenge, everybody's challenge in the enlightened, so-called enlightened world, is to find a way to incorporate these insights into our work and still go back to work. Mm-hmm. I mean, the article we read last week was looking around at possible ways that architects could do this, and none of them seemed terribly convincing. They never do when anyone's asked for evidence. Most of what you do for social justice is just in not being a bastard, just going to work every day and trying not to do people over. But if you want to say more specifically, how could architects work for social justice, then you're back to saying, well, I'll work for the local community against the developer, or I'll work for social housing projects, or I think we should read Tafuri coming up soon, because in his analysis, because he examines architectural ideology, and in his analysis, the modernist period, and this is I think this is a weakness in the essay we've just read. Spyro Kostov is quoted as saying that modernist architects didn't ask the users how they wanted to live, despite making claims about being social. I think what he missed there, and what Tafuri picks up on, is architectural ideology is not just symbolic, it also is directly productive. And Tafuri calls it the ideology of the plan. He refers to people like Ernst May in the 1920s in Frankfurt, and others in Germany, others in Holland, who were given this power at a time of social democracy, given a power as architects to actually become directly political and to make decisions about the city, which had to do with distribution of wealth. We live in a neoliberal era in which this power has been, withdrawn in some ways, but maybe can be reclaimed in other ways.
I think, Mark, like, I mean, I was just sort of listening to that, you know, as you were talking there, I was just sort of relating it to my own experiences. And I do think that it's something that we touched on with when Tom was here a couple of weeks, or maybe last week, that there is this sense that, you know, so if something is going wrong with, let's say, if we're not producing adequate housing, enough and decent housing for everybody to live in, for all members of society, somehow some sort of finger of blame, some sort of finger is pointed at the architect, and or else somehow the architect feels that a finger is pointing at them, even if it's not. My suspicion, my own feeling from years of working is, I think it's something to do with the fact that architects tend to be a decent bunch of people, as decent as anybody else. They try not to be an arsehole at work, and to show respect, and to be a bit of fun. But a lot of the time you spend working, you're obliged to spend working with developers, and developers, particularly the Irish ones, I would say. I've worked with some really nasty American ones, and the Irish ones are at least twice as bad. You know, you end up, I think what happens is you see so many terrible things being done in the name of development, in the name of whatever, that you develop a sense of guilt or responsibility that somehow you have to make up for the developer's weaknesses, or maybe your own weaknesses, and not standing up to the developer the last time because he didn't send you the check and you weren't able to pay for the computers and so on. That it's the relationship of the architect to the private developer that frequently puts the architect in this very difficult position, where they're called to answer questions that really aren't necessarily their questions to answer. And I think it's something that's at play. I think, for example, you know, how we deal with planning, or how we make more better, beautiful cities, or how we do better by young underprivileged kids and people who aren't, you know, sort of housed correctly, and all of these things that we all know are wrong. I mean, you know, at its core, I feel, oh, well, what I can do maybe is, if perhaps I have a tiny little moment of genius in making a space for a music room for young kids, and they'll never know it was me, but they'll just sort of go, oh, I love that space. I think, okay, I'll have done my bit. On the bigger story of why is it that there's so much awful politics brought to bear into making sure that the people who need the most never seem to get it, you know, we have to figure out a way as architects of, I think, of maybe not getting caught up in that debate in the way that we tend to, which is to be on the back foot. We need a new mode of engagement on that. That's my feeling on it anyway.
Doesn't that suggest that you do need to be engaged rather than blinkered?
I think you do need to be engaged, Hugh. I think what you need to do is pick your debate.
Yeah.
I think that you know, frequently, I mean, the Johnny Ronan situation at the minute, you know, there's sort of a Johnny Ronan versus Frank McDonald kind of thing, which I think, Mark, you're right. I think it's a fake argument. You know, those two are part of the same gang. You know, they've been writing about each other. Frank was writing very nice things about developers only 10 years ago in a book that came out. You know, it's a false debate. You know, they're not. Neither of them are arguing about. They're not arguing about something that is crucial or substantial. I think the Irish Times has traditionally been taken. They really have been the sort of the villains of the piece, if you like, in the Garry Stevens essay for the past 20 or 30 years. You know, they established a sort of a mode of behavior where architects filled or fulfilled a role which really had nothing at all to do with architecture, with the making of architecture. And they've never been, I think, you know, they should have been called to task, because they, you know, they are the most significant paper of record in the country, or maybe they were the most vital organ of dissemination of this kind of thing in the general public. But you know, I definitely think they constructed constructed a sort of a Stevenson type field or Bourdieu type field and place the architect right in that. And I still think we're sort of still in that, even now.
What I kind of thought about the Frank McDonald, Johnny Ronan thing, like the side that Frank McDonald is kind of on is the frustrated side that it's really ultimately about that architects are powerless in the kind of development that is going to happen, which is the kind of development that actually most people probably want. But like that tower proposal, like that is so divorced from what architecture in Ireland that Irish architects would call is.
I mean, it's designed by Irish architects. It's designed by Henry J. Lyons, right?
Yeah, but like no one in Henry J. Lyons, or
No.
like we wouldn't use them as a reference in school, like
No, but a lot of you will go and work for them.
yeah.
I mean, and they're perfectly nice people. You know what I mean?
And they have a huge impact in Dublin. They build a lot of things, and a lot of things I like as well.
It really should be 60 stories. I mean, you do agree. Sorry.
It could be a bit better. It could be a bit better for sure.
According to the article that Frank wrote, he said it was looking better before the planners got their hands on it. Which is probably
I'm sure. But I mean, like that's the thing, is it is completely bound up with. It's not at all separate from the mainstream of architectural production. Like, it's completely bound up with it. And yeah, anyway.
I think Hugh, though, I just have to keep an eye on the time of the lecture. I think Hugh, though, there is an element of, like, which neither Johnny Ronan himself nor Frank McDonald is prepared to talk about, which is that the planning system in this country, which allows for this kind of incredible speculation. You can just turn around in the morning and say, look, well, let's just put something 60 stories here just for no particular reason. I mean, that needs to be, discussed in the most fundamental way. But provided we allow this kind of most extraordinary antisocial, anti-intellectual, anti-everything form of system of development to occur, then these arguments are inevitable. So I think, what Johnny Ronan is a developer, and what he's going to do is develop. If somebody says 1,000 stories, we build 1,000 stories. But the media I think they can be pushed harder to be able to bring a more reflective analysis to the situation. I mean, they don't have to engage face to face with Johnny Ronan. It's not him versus him. This is, they've made it a kind of a, sort of, it's somehow personalized and somehow Stevensonian in a way, when it just simply doesn't have to be. Just all we have to.
Sorry, Hugh?
Yeah, all we have to say is,
well, I mean,
planning systems.
That's the thing about, like, maybe the making it into this clash of whatever personalities, is that it perpetuates. It does nothing to, like, there's much more careful critiques, thoroughgoing critiques, like Philip Lawton versus Johnny Ronan would be better,
more interesting,
or like any geographer looking at the city today. Or Michelle Norris versus Johnny
Norris. Do you want me to take that approach? Do you think it's better to? I still think Frank thing. I'm just have an eye to getting a bit of a splash here.
Yeah, but if you could get Michelle Norris, I mean,
I'd love to get Michelle Norris. That would be a good idea. She's brilliant at analysis. She's mainly housing though.
Her analysis of how, like, I don't know if people listen to that radio lecture in the Davis series that she gave about the way, like, very interesting. She linked the sort of financialization of housing back to Whitaker. The point where the house starts to become property, effectively, starts to become an asset, and actually there's a deinvestment in housing from that point forward. Yeah, which is kind of really interesting because
her whole analysis of the socialization of private ownership is what she calls it. She's the head of social policy here in UCD. She's brilliant. Yeah. Another person, Andrew McLaren from Trinity, is retired now. He had a really good analysis of it. I'll go and pursue those. We could turn it into something. Owen, we don't invite people from Henry J. Lyons to come and tutor here. I'm involved very often in discussions about, not tutor, I mean come as guest critics. I mean, I'm tutor as well, but I'm often involved in who should we get to come for the crit. That's a typical thing that you have among tutors. And this is a really, really, really Bourdieusian moment. The almost imperceptible choices that are made and the judgments that are made that you would need electron microscope, some sort of social version of an electron microscope to see what's going down in those conversations. But I can tell you all one thing, which I know to be true. Nobody will ever be asked who's involved in a commercial practice. This is not a cynical point I'm making.
Mark, not entirely true.
Maybe not entirely true,
no,
but let me finish my point.
But last year we actually, well, it's a, sort of, this is, I'm both confirming and challenging your point, because last year we tried to set up a system of having people come in from large practice to review work, and it was mostly in the comprehensive design studio year 4.
Yeah.
So we had Henry J. and Scots and so forth, but actually it didn't work that well. The interesting thing was the conversation didn't flow along the usual lines, let's put it that way. So that's kind of confirming what you're saying.
Well, I'll tell you why. I've been thinking, because I'm teaching a lot around this for years in 4th year seminars and so on, about this stuff and reading this stuff. Sorry, I threw that in to try and lend some weight to what I'm about to say, which I realize is quite pathetic. It should stand on its merits or not at all. But the point I'm going to make is not asking commercial people people who are commercial large practices, and why it doesn't flow if they do come in is because you are seeing a clash of two fields. And the field of restricted practice, which we're all involved in as teachers within the university, which our students are all involved in, is, if you like, the pure architectural design field. And it actually has to work in this incubator, because the logic of economic capital is actually, for us to gain our field, to make our field productive in symbolic sense, it has to always be, if you like, nurtured in the symbolic field.
Yeah, that's absolutely true,
and
Mark.
Key for Bourdieu's theory, and I'm sorry to go back to Bourdieu, is this autonomy heteronomy relationship. It's a very complicated one. For students of late Marxism, it's a major point. And I realize not everyone's a student of late Marxism, but this is the great challenge of late Marxism, is to explain agency within Marx's view of structure. Because ultimately Marx seems to be saying that everyone is just driven by the economy and no one has any freedom of choice and so on. But Bourdieu's contribution is to show how this autonomy or agency of cultural production is nonetheless exists, is both autonomous and heteronomous. And the key line in symbolic violence is it contributes its own specifically symbolic power to those power relations, which it is based on. This is why we don't have people from commercial practices, because they're speaking another language. It literally is not the same language.
But Mark, you can, I mean, we had, neither Alice or Owen, I had doing a seminar at the moment, we got Conor McCabe in. Actually, we've gotten him in a couple of times from Henry J, looking at workplace architecture, looking at commercial architecture. So when you bring somebody in on their own
field,
turf, actually, we asked him to read Reinier de Graaf.
Okay, yeah, he's good.
Yeah, and he kind of liked it. He sort of like. I actually think we should and could be doing more to kind of try and make those discussions happen, because you have to reconcile. I mean, what he describes in the start of that book is how hard it is for students once they graduate to reconcile themselves to the horrible reality of commercial practice, or the fact that it's suddenly a different language completely.
I do think it's worth remembering.
Yeah,
I do think it's worth remembering a little bit that, well, in my view, that when we talk about commercial practice in Britain and Ireland, it's not the same as commercial practice in continental Europe or even North America. They're not the same thing. My experiences of both have been radically different. Yeah. So I think some of the, I mean, after after the establishment of the Free State, I mean, essentially, we just inherited kind of a system that we never questioned, the system that had been established in the UK, especially with regard to everything, planning as well. And, if you discount de Valera's first ridiculous constitution and go straight to the second, I mean, it's a document that is so lacking in any real thought or any real sort of serious engagement with the idea of what forms a constitution. And I think a lot of it, I think our problem relates to that. The fundamental, the building blocks of the society are not rigid, not well teased out, put together, established, made, and we can't get around that. I think we just, our relationship with our social structure in this country is so far distant compared to all of our neighbors. Anybody who spent any time in France or Germany or America realizes that the connection between you and the thing that gathers everybody together and brings them together as a piece is so in your face every day. It's so part of your day-to-day life. And Macron's talking at the moment about the importance of the Republic against communitarianism, and they're talking about it every single day in the French media, and it's the biggest talking point. If you were to have the same kind of discussion in Ireland, nobody would have the slightest idea what you're talking about, not the slightest. And this is, getting back to the Johnny Ronan, Pratt McDonald business, is that, nobody sees that there is another way to argue this case. That at the starting point is the architect is put in a false position because there's something wrong, a position that is unique essentially to Dublin and maybe to London, Manchester and Glasgow, because of this curious thing that we've got, which allows it for a certain type of behavior, but nobody wants to talk about it or nobody sees it. So it doesn't happen in Germany, it doesn't happen in France, it doesn't happen in America for the most part, except in some states. You don't find yourself in that curious situation.